You'll note that in 1919 there was almost no unemployment, and the reason for that is pretty obvious. Everybody's at war. 1920, they start returning from the Army.
What happened around 1920 going into 1921 was that suddenly the economy very quickly was hit by a recession or depression in which unemployment shot up very fast from 4% to over 12%. Industrial production was way down. All the figures of economic health were suddenly tanking.
Well, you still had a society that is heavily farming, maybe, I don't know, 30-40% farms. We hadn't completely made the transition over to a full industrial economy. So a lot of people had to go back to work on the farms, and you had a lot of farm overproduction in the early 20s, which brought down farm prices.
Normally the free market would be telling you, don't do this, don't produce this, produce that. And so you get distortions throughout the system. And eventually the system can't continue to function with these distortions. And ultimately the sugar high that creating a lot of pieces of paper out of thin air gets you on eventually crashes down. Warren Harding is one of these people historians love to hate, and they claim they hate him because of how corrupt he was, but his corruption is just so utterly pitiful and pathetic compared to the corruption we just take for granted today.
Harding runs on this phrase, return to normalcy, which he never actually uttered, but he returns on this phrase, let's return to normalcy, meaning let's go back to the way things were before the war. Let's cut taxes.
When he accepts the Republican nomination in 1920, and then in 1921, his inaugural address, well, you know what? He actually more or less understood what was going on. He said, look, you know, we've had this credit inflation, and now it's coming undone. There's no way to stop this. Eventually, the market has to correct itself. If prices have been bid up too high, we can't pretend that this is sustainable. They got to come down. And so let's let them come down. Let's not continue to live in the fantasy world. Let's let them come down, let the market adjust itself. And he says any wild experiments are only going to lead to more instability. They're only going to prolong this pain.
He enlists Andrew Mellon. Who in this great story goes to see Harding in his hometown, carries his own bags up the street. Mr. President, I'm here because you requested to see me. He said, I want you to be Secretary of the Treasury. And Mellon says, I don't want the job. And Harding says, that's why I want you to be Secretary of the Treasury. I want people who aren't interested in power. I want people who aren't there because they want the job. I want people who will go to serve, to do the people's business. So that convinces Mellon, and he goes to Washington. The first thing he does as Secretary of the Treasury is perform a massive study of income and outflows of the Treasury, and he finds out that every time you raise tax rates, the revenue starts to taper off, and that there is a law of diminishing returns here. And maybe we would be better off by cutting tax rates.
Tax rates are reduced not just for the rich, as the propagandists like to tell us, but for all income groups. And the result is a very rapid recovery from what was a very deep economic problem.
He introduces the Laffer curve some, 60 or 70 years before Art Laffer does. And so he convinces Congress and Harding, and so they cut taxes.
In effect, Andrew Mellon was anticipating that there's a prohibitive range beyond which, even from the point of view of a tax looter in the government who likes oppressing people and likes getting a lot of loot, that even from that person's own point of view, above a certain rate of income tax, you're going to start getting less revenue because people are just going to start hiding their income or putting it in tax-free havens or whatever. He winds up cutting the budget, and this is left over from Woodrow Wilson before him. The government budget is cut basically in half between 1920 and 1922. The national debt is reduced by about 1/3. What's interesting in particular about this episode is this is before the Federal Reserve actually started engaging in what's called open market operations, where they try to pour money into the economy by buying bonds or withdraw money from the economy. They hadn't even started doing that. They didn't start that till about 1922. So what in fact you see is the Federal Reserve by and large staying out. I mean, imagine that. They stayed out of a major crisis. And yet here we have a crisis that, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, is basically over by the summer of 1921. The Earth did not break free of its axis and go spinning toward the sun. The economy, in fact, recovered. It does, in fact, adjust without creating a lot of funny money. And Joseph Schumpeter, one of the great 20th century economists, Schumpeter said this episode alone proves and is a great example of how the system regulates itself. And we're not allowed to say that either. How the system corrects itself.
The U.S. economy can and will recover if government just stays the heck out. That our economy is sound, that the American people are industrious when given incentives to be industrious. 20s are a very good comparison, late 50s, 1980s, part of the 90s, especially after 94 when you start to see the stock market take off again. They are eras of prosperity. The two go hand in hand. Low government activity, high employment, invention, innovation. But you know what else goes along with this? High levels of failure. In every one of these decades, you also have high levels of failure in the private sector. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. People are taking risks. They're being rewarded for taking risks.
Keynesian, a lot of people might not even know what this word means, refers to economist John Maynard Keynes, who wrote so-called General Theory in 1936. Keynes is arguing exactly what governments already want to hear, which is that you people are indispensable, and so we need you people to steer our ship of state just right. We need you to inject spending at just the right moment, or to inject new money. But one of the things I've pointed out in my writing on the Depression of 1920 is that you find a lot of Keynesians who, looking back at this episode, will admit this. They're not going to pretend it never existed. They will admit it, but what's eerie about it, Orwellian about it, is they admit it in one sentence, draw no conclusions about it, and then move on. Well, you know what? Maybe we ought to draw some conclusions about this. They did nothing, and it was over extremely quickly. I mean, why not draw a conclusion from this?